listening to Outside the Wall, a subliminal advertising campaign for Fortnite by Epic Games. I'm Exdeath, and I'm being joined, as always, by my co-hosts Raymond Wallenstein.
Hello.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about Isao Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies, which is the first film in our Isao Takahata fortnight. We came to this film because it was actually fortnight where the second part came first. I had to convince Rain to watch the movie Pom Poko because of his phobia of testicles, and so we eventually added Grave to accommodate a Studio Ghibli based fortnight. So that's all the intro we need, and I'll get Rain to start on his opinion of the film.
So, this I believe was my 10th Ghibli film that I watched, and I can say that I like the film, and it's really great. But it is quite a harrowing experience. It is very much very depressing, let's say, and bleak take on what civilians must suffer through a war. The Grave of the Fireflies is set during World War II, and it focuses on pair of siblings that are left orphaned during the bombings of their town. And well, Seita and Setsuko are there's a lot of focus on their relationship, how they enjoy their time as siblings, how they play together, how they go out despite the fact that there's a war going on, but also how they have to suffer the effects of the war on their town and country as a whole, and even their own lives directly. They lose their mother during a bombing. Their father is in the Navy, so they haven't seen him for a while. They move out to live with an aunt of theirs, but the aunt is very critical of Seita, our main. We could say that he's the main character of the film. His behavior during it, he has a very well, at least apparently compared to other kids around his age, during that time period, it seems that he's a bit more relaxed, and I think that he is in a sense mostly trying to make sure that his sister enjoys the time during the war, despite all the terrible things that are happening. He tries to make sure that she's still happy. So they end up moving out to avoid further conflict with their aunt, and it's really a powerful film. I realized after watching this that it would also be interesting perhaps to pair it with Roberto Benigni's La Vita de Vela. Life is Beautiful. It's also a film set during World War II, but that it is not focused on on soldiers fighting an epic battle or either winning or losing, but rather on the civilians that are during the war and the terribleness, the kind of misfortune that they must go through. And I think this film this did very powerfully. I certainly need more time to watch this film again because it's very consuming, emotionally consuming. But I think that's also a testament to how powerful it is. And yeah, I definitely recommend this. This was my second Isao Takahata film too. I have watched before only yesterday, so this was the second one that I watched, and I think it's better than only yesterday, but that's also kind of a bit not too fair on the other one. So, Wally.
Yes, so this has been my second Ghibli film, and I definitely am coming around to the art style of the Ghibli style, for lack of a better word. So far, I think out of all the anime movies we have seen, I think this might be my favorite so far. Obviously, again, I have to have the caveat that I am the novice when it comes to anime compared to the two of you. So the breadth of movies I've seen with anime is very limited. So take that with as you will. I enjoyed this film, I think, because of the subject material and because of its themes. Because, as Reem, you pointed out, this isn't a war film. It's a film that happens to take place in the setting of a war, that being the Second World War, and it focuses on the other side of the conflict, that being civilians and how the war affects them. This is definitely a type of film, because it's told from the Japanese perspective, that might not have done well in America, particularly when this film came out, because the propaganda machine, even today, would continue to tout that only military objectives were attacked in Japan during the Second World War, when historians and others know that that isn't the case. But nevertheless, I think this is a very moving story. It tells basically how war affects families in general, and in particular, how it affects families that are particular to Japan. And we see bits and pieces of the Japanese culture at the time to rear its head, particularly when the conflict between Saita and his aunt, where his aunt basically is demanding that he become in other words, patriotic citizen and do his due duty to help provide for his family, which is essentially his sister at this point. And it's at least for me, Saita's rebellious nature in that respect is sort of also criticizing in a way this sort of culture that had existed in Japan, and essentially that the Second World War kind of wiped out in a way, not in addition to not we're not just talking about lives, but the culture as well, this sort of very Zen Buddhist kamikaze culture that helped promote the Japanese Empire. But I'm starting to ramble a bit. But otherwise, I did enjoy this a lot. There is some symbology in here as well that I noticed that was quite touching, particularly when Saito and Setsuko are talking about collecting the fireflies and watching them, and then we see in later events in the film the bombs from the American airplanes drop and have these little flickers of light, and in the background they almost look like fireflies, which I think was very touching and a poignant moment. But overall, I did enjoy this film, and I think this might be so far my favorite anime.
Okay, so in contrast to that, I think this is actually my least favorite anime movie out of the ones we've talked to on this podcast so far. But that's just a testament to the strength of that set of films overall, rather than anything about this, because this is definitely an excellent movie. Like Wally says, it's much more focused on the human effects of war than any of the particulars of the war itself. It could possibly even be set in another war altogether and still work and look quite similar as a film, although the Second World War was definitely the best choice. And the main reason for that is because of the sort of omnipresence of the war in interrupting the lives of civilians during the time. So, the way we see this in the film is that in between instances of fire bombings, Saita and Setsuko will try to sort of go back to their normal day-to-day lives, even doing things like playing on the beach. But these things will be continually and randomly interrupted by another firebombing that they have to flee from, try and duck into a shelter. And that element definitely helps to sell the sense of how the war has a negative impact on their lives overall. Now, when you're going for a very harrowing story like this movie, which is essentially about watching two children slowly starve to death, it's important to manage the right balance in terms of the tone, which is to say that there should be some scenes of relief or lightheartedness that help us get an investment in the characters and the world. Because if it's just really sad, miserable people being depressed all the time, you won't even really care that much that they're dying. And this movie is really expert in that kind of tone mixing. There's quite a few scenes that are designed to sort of show us the childishness and levity of the two characters, contrasted against the horrible destruction of the war in their later stages of our lives. And that does a really good job of enhancing the emotional impact of the latter type of scenes because we build a familiarity and investment in these two characters. Yeah, I guess I won't say too much more because it would just be redundant discussions of the like war related themes that the other two have already touched on. So I'll leave it at that. This is a really great moving film and I highly recommend it.
I was going to mention that what you mentioned about the childishness of them, I think this film also touches to an extent like loss of innocence. Like one of those examples, I think, is the scene that when they're walking in the beach, and Setsuko is just like strolling through the beach and finds a dead body cover, and she asks if he's sleeping, and Seita just comes along and asks her to leave it like that, leave it there. So it's something that you I think I will say that it's still common in many places in the world, not just war-ridden countries, but also countries with high criminality rates, where you will sometimes kids will find up a dead body in a place, and then that kind of the kind of event marks them, and you start realizing more about mortality and the fact that people just sometimes go away, and it's in a sense perhaps desensitizes us because of the common occurrence of them. I will mention that to an extent that's a bit of the well, like the reactions of other people in the movie. Like say that it is very hurting for him, for his sister to be suffering, but the way that other people react to it, despite the fact that Setsuko is a very young girl, she's probably only like 4 years old, I think, which is almost a toddler still.
Yes, well, I think it's the film subliminally in two ways talks about this loss of innocence. And one, it questions, at least for me, whether there is such a loss in the first place, because we see that Setsuko isn't, we don't see an effect on her when she sees that dead body in the same way we don't necessarily see a very traumatizing effect on her when she does eventually find out her mother is dead, other than sadness, which is normal. But I think it definitely focuses on this whole sort of paranoia that some cultures have. I know here, like in the US, it's sort of paranoia of protecting the children as much as possible, in using that sometimes as an excuse for other more insidious things. But that's one thing I think that stood out for me. And the other two is it sort of critiques this whole coming of age narrative that is very common in storytelling, where we see Saita is essentially through the events of having his father be away in the Navy and eventually losing his mother, the other characters in the story are sort of eventually trying to force him to come of age or to basically become adult. And his sort of refusal to do that, based on, like I had said, the culture of Japan at the time, as well as just the very nature of his circumstances, I think is also very interesting and is sort of breaks some of the tropes of common storytelling that we might have seen in another film.
Yeah, so that story aspect is definitely one that I want to talk about because although this movie is very universally beloved for the most part, there are a few people I've encountered who dislike it, and one of the most maybe the most valid points I've seen made, although I don't love it, is people will often kind of take issue with Saita's inability to grow up as it were in some of the particular choices that he makes. There's a scene sort of in the later part of this movie where another like a seemingly benevolent older man suggests that he kind of swallow his pride and go back to his aunt, and it is possible that he might have survived if he had made that decision. But and so it's interesting for us to analyze why he may have decided nonetheless not to do that, whether just because the aunt was like sufficiently abusive, you might say, to that would even constitute a worse option in a sense, or just because of some flaw in his character. But when that is used as a criticism of the film overall, I don't think it's super compelling because it goes back to this issue we talked about before about how a character can still be like humanly written even if they aren't doing things that we necessarily agree with.
Right.
And secondly, people will say that it kind of makes it hard for them to sympathize with Saita and Setsuko, but I think that's just a little bit.
That's on the viewer, not on the film itself.
Yeah, that's a really harsh, not very compassionate way to look at things, especially when it comes to Setsuko, who doesn't really have a say in the matter and is like 5 years old or something.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, another thing that relates to it as well. People will say that basically Saita should get a job, and I think there's a little bit of ambiguity in the film as to whether that's even possible for him. I remember there's one scene where the aunt tells him to either go back to school or find a job, and he comments that the school is and the factory that he previously worked at are both destroyed, and there's nowhere else for him to go. So it may very well be the case that he couldn't even really have done that, no matter how much he had wanted to. And the fact that he had apparently previously worked in a factory shows that he did have some willingness to do so.
Right. It's very much a kind of knee jerk reaction that people seem to have, even in today's culture. That, you know, if someone's down and out, their response quickly is, and this also speaks to a certain ideology that, oh, well, you just need to find a job because someone will want to employ you, or you just go to school. Whereas, as you pointed out, the reality is in this movie that the school was blown to bits, and that because of the way that buildings keep getting bombed and are out of business, that there is no work, that they basically have to scrounge.
It's you're poor because you want to, basically.
Right. It's something I've commented on before that at least in the American culture, there's something very. It's like a combination of Calvinist and frontiersman attitude, but obviously that's different here in this Japanese context, where I think it's tied more to this sort of honor system, where if you don't do this, you're disgracing your family and your ancestors.
Hmm. And we can even observe a certain degree of hypocrisy in the aunt as well, because Saita brings food and things into the family by selling off his mother's possessions and by digging up some provisions that he had stored before the bombing that destroys his house. But she still kind of like calls him a lazy, worthless slaw who isn't contributing. So there's that angle on it as well.
Indeed, even if he couldn't like go out to work, he was still providing, and it is proven that he still has like savings that he has been providing, but she does make a. I think it's also like very harsh to expect on it, because even if Seita is only like 14 in the movie, 14, 15, that's still a relatively young age. So his actions are to one extent also still like comprehensible and acceptable. It's not like he was like 20 something and like in hit the prime of his life. So
Yeah, in the critique I read on my anime list where they were complaining about this, they did say that a 14-year-old would be considered old enough to work and stuff in Japanese culture at the time, but we could take the stance that the modern, like later Japanese filmmakers were commenting on that Japanese culture in the negative sense by depicting it this way.
Right.
Because I don't really know. It's kind of like child labor with 14.
Yeah. So the one thing, though, maybe to go on a bit of a tangent, I talked about this briefly when we had seen Totoro, which was my first Ghibli film. But for me, the thing that stands out about the animation of this studio is the fact that even the background drawings are very well done and very colorful, and there's a lot of detail in them as well. Whereas with some other animations that I've seen, that's usually the most of the budget, if we can say, is provided to the foreground or the things that are actually being animated, and the background is kind of sometimes very hastily drawn or is enough is there to give you the impression of what it is, but it's something I noticed in both this and in Totoro that the backgrounds are very well done. They can almost, if you took out the animations and just had that as a standalone painting, it would be something I could see in like an art gallery.
yeah, it is something. It is basically the staple of Studio Ghibli. I believe they call this cell animation, in which they place characters in front of a detailed background. So they work on. I believe they work on them like separately and then place them. So that's why there's this greater emphasis on the detail, as you mentioned, on the backgrounds themselves, instead of just like a character against a completely blank background, or not necessarily blank, like a single color background, and the focus is more on them than the rest.
I
So
think cell animation was actually pretty much the predominantly used technique in almost the entire industry before things like Flash came along and sort of obsoleted it to a certain extent. So it probably isn't specifically because of that that Joey's backgrounds are so good. Even some of the examples that Wally might have observed as having lower quality backgrounds probably still use cell animation, if I had to guess, though I'm not an expert. But it is certainly true that like Ghibli's animation in general is of very high quality, and something that might also add to the sort of beauty of the backgrounds is that their directors, I think especially Hayao Miyazaki, have this kind of prodigious imagination too that they bring to their films. And we kind of see a bit of that in Totoro with the sort of supernatural things that the characters encounter and the designs of those and all those elements show definitely a very active creativity on Miyazaki's part.
Yes, that's something I also noticed too. Is that there definitely seems to be this very spiritual theme that runs through several of these films, or magical realism, if we can use a better
Mhm.
word.
Okay,
That it
so
isn't.
briefly, could you define magical realism in case there are any viewers who don't know what it
Yes.
is?
So magical realism essentially is taking real life events but putting some type of fictionalized supernatural thing to them. It doesn't necessarily detract from the story that's being told. So, a very good example or common examples in literature Um, Two would be Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude,
Mm-hmm.
and then Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children are two prime examples of magic realism. It's considered essentially a postmodern theme in art. I, for one, am sort of I like it very much. It's something that I've recently come across a couple of years ago as a theme, and it's something I've really enjoyed seeing done because it expands upon the ways stories can be told. And that's all. I'll shut up before I get too dragged on about this.
Yeah, so you observe that with respect to the spirituality sort of that appears in Grave of the Fireflies, I think with the kind of ghosts of Saita and Setsuko.
Yes.
And yeah, in Ghibli it would be sort of like Totoro, or in Totoro it would be the presence of the character Totoro and the similar characters who may be representations of the children's imagination, or could be some kind of supernatural element. And yeah, I think another aspect that sometimes gets related to magical realism is that whatever the supernatural element is, it won't be the characters won't really treat it as if it's something crazy. Like they'll kind of just react to it as if it's a common part of their lives, and that can possibly relate to the way that all these Ghibli films are sort of based on traditional Japanese um, spirituality and such that we as Westerners might find a little bit more unusual. So another example that I observed in a Japanese film of this actually is in Rashomon, where they summon the spirit of the. They're trying to determine the truth of a murder case essentially, and they actually summon the spirit of the victim, to channeling him through his wife to testify, which was pretty odd from a Western perspective, but probably comes off as a lot more normal in Japan because it's based around sort of their traditional religion.
Yeah,
Well, another good example would be one we have seen but haven't talked about yet, we will in a future episode, is Pompoko as well.
indeed.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think one you touched on an interesting subject there that we may have talked before. Yeah, we talked before about it. I think a lot in Harakiri, which was the fact that sometimes a lot of these foreign films don't get the chance or aren't as well received, let's say, because of in our these Eastern films in our Western cultures, because of the fact that they implement a lot of magical realism, spiritual elements or cultural elements that seem jarring for us. I say us in general, but I think that there's, when you explain that about the like the Rashomon example about the chants, and also the like the folklore or the spirits in the Ghibli films in general, made me realize that to an extent one of the reasons these anime films and such are also kind of popular, relatively popular in Latin American culture, is the fact that we also have a lot of folklore and urban legends about that are still told day to day, and people are a bit more open to that micro-realism possibility, which is perhaps also one of the reasons why Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cine de Soledad, is also a very well received and admittedly very good piece of Latin American literature.
okay. So although you say that the sort of Japanese nature of it makes it harder for Westerners to appreciate, it should be noted that Studio Ghibli is probably one of the, if not the most broadly appealing anime studios to Western audiences, and they kind of managed to tap into a sort of universal appeal that you also see in companies like Nintendo and Disney and Pixar, where they are loved by basically everybody, even including critics. Something that not very many people manage to achieve. So
Mm-hmm.
good for them, I guess.
Well, I think too, it's part of it is maybe not getting hung up on some of the different cultural things, and they're just seeing some of the similarities, or in another sense, just suspending disbelief. I know, for me at least, it speaks highly of how impactful magical realism can be in storytelling. That even though it is telling this very, with Grave of Fireflies, it's telling this very serious, heart wrenching story, the fact that it ties in this sort of spirituality of it, I think, helps speak to just the nature of not just Japanese culture, but maybe just culture in general, of how we treat the dead and how we look at afterlife.
Yeah, I think Grave of the Fireflies does so in a relatively hopeful manner at the end, but it is still a quite, as I mentioned,
It is a
desolate experience.
tearjerker.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The spirituality in this sense, where the characters are shown to sort of live on after their deaths, does help soften the like really harrowing nature of the film. That's probably part of the reason why it was included.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think that's a very touching scene when Setsuko and Seita arrive at their final destination, which I think is
Yes,
more than Japan, I believe.
right. Which actually brings up probably the one criticism I have of this film, and I've mentioned this to both of you before, is how early the scene between Saita's and Setsuko's ghost is. Basically, we see them meet, or we see Setsuko's ghost meet Saito's ghost very early in the film, whereas I think the emotional impact would have been better from a film standpoint if that were shown towards the end. That basically, Saita's kind of on his own journey, like revisiting everything he's done and basically reminiscing on his little sister. And then at the very end, we see him meet Satsuko's ghost, and then they basically find happiness in the afterlife, which I think again would have a much better emotional impact than how they showed it in the very beginning of the film.
Yeah, I think that's a comment. That's something we had probably agreed on, that the starting sequence and scene where they meet up, and after the guard throws the ashes of Setsuko. So I believe in that sense it was the fact that Setsuko's ashes were there that allowed him to meet his sister from the start. But yeah, from a narrative standpoint, it does seem it would have been better that they had
Yeah,
met up later.
I agree. I think that scene would have been better moved towards the end, and it kind of relates to a common storytelling technique in general, which is that anything that can be enhanced, let's say, by having an emotional investment in the characters involved, should be placed later on in the film. So, for example, it's usually a really bad idea to start a movie out with a big action sequence because if you don't really care about the characters involved, then the tension of whether they'll survive or be wounded or anything like that is basically lost. And similarly, this scene, if we know that and care about the characters, the tragic nature of what's happening to them will carry a much greater emotional impact than if we're just meeting them and don't have the same kind of investment. So that's probably the main reason why it should have been moved back.
Right. It reminds me of another classic trope in filmmaking where at the beginning of the film you have the main character narrate, "So how did I get here?"
Yeah.
And it's like, so at the you already know at the beginning of the film that the main character gets out of this okay because they're assumingly still alive. Although there have been some films who have taken that and twisted it a bit to surprise the audience. But
I know American Beauty is one example of that. Yeah.
I think with I don't know if we touched on everything that we wanted to talk about with the Fireflies.
yes,
There's one thing that I want to add quickly, which is the use of the soundtrack, or maybe in some places the lack of a soundtrack. It's something I observed that I think really helped sell the impact of certain scenes. That it was actually quite a few instances where there was no music playing, and kind of just lets us sort of have to sit in the moment of of some kind of difficult subject matter, like when Setsuko's trying to, or when Saita is trying to talk to his sister about their mother without directly telling her that she died, for example. It kind of helps those scenes breathe naturally instead of adding like an over dramatic score to them.
yes. Unfortunately, that's a problem with a lot of movie making today in the Hans Zimmer era. Even though I do like Hans Zimmer's music, I think he's one that's notorious for constantly having something playing during every scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that this film uses stillness and silence, I think, is commendable because it can help sell us the emotional impact of everything where the characters don't really know how to respond to what they're facing.
Yeah, I believe this is Takahata's. You can notice this is something common in his directing, where he tries to make the soundtrack breathing naturally in the film. I noticed this a lot in the Tale of Princess Kaguya, which is so far my favorite Takahata film, and I know that he specifically asked for that film to have a soundtrack that will like seep through the scenes and not he didn't want the music itself, let's say, to express what like let us know what the character was feeling, but do so be a part of the natural environment in that one. So I think this is also something very noticeable in his directing style, that he wants the soundtrack to be to blend in nicely and not just bombard you with through it.
So I guess maybe the one last thing you can maybe bring up is would this be a film you think that would be apt to show, say, someone of Saito's age, someone in their teens? Like, would this be a young adult, I guess, fiction, or would you see this being more as just sort of a general anti-war type of film? Despite the fact that I think the director himself had said it's not an anti-war film.
I guess it can kind of serve as both. I think it's. I wouldn't have too many objections about showing it to very many people. I would probably even be okay showing it to a younger kid. Maybe not like a one that's Setsuko's age, say, but maybe one that's like an 8 or so could probably handle it all right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I would view it as like a particularly focused anti-war film. It's more of a like just family audiences fun sort of film, but depressing instead.
Yeah, I think by someone like Seita, yeah, young adult, I think there definitely is a movie that's worth sharing and showing them. I don't see anything why you
Well, they would
wouldn't
be
be
able to
sure.
relate more to some of the stuff Saito's going through with the pressures of trying to find a job and stuff like that. Although even more for him, considering he's in the midst of a war.
Mm-hmm.
So that would give you a particular reason to show it to somebody in their early teens. Say,
Yeah.
Maybe that speaks to our own opinions on the loss of innocence.
Well, I don't know. You'd like to do a summary then, Ulix?
yeah, that's we can probably leave it off here. So despite a few slightly overdramatic moments and some parts that are tough viewing for very unsympathetic people, I think Grave of the Fireflies is one of the more universally enjoyable films that we've discussed so far, and probably be recommended to just about anybody. So that being said, this has been Outside the Wall. Be sure to add me on Fortnite under the username XXX I love cats don't dance XXX, and we hope you'll tune in next time. Goodbye.